I have told this story only a handful of times in my life, and each time I have found it harder to explain why a few overheard sentences in a cold stone corridor mattered more to me than every lesson I was ever formally taught about what it means to wear a crown one day. I was 11 years old. I am not 11 anymore, not by a long distance, and I have stood in enough receiving lines and said enough careful, weightless things to enough careful, weightless people that I sometimes forget what it felt like to hear someone tell the truth simply because he did not know anyone was listening. But I remember that corridor. I remember the smell of old wax and cold stone, and I remember a voice that did not know it was teaching me anything. And I remember walking away from it a slightly different person than the one who had walked in. I should tell you first that I was where I was not supposed to be, because that is the part of the story I am least proud of and the part that, in the end, mattered most. That spring, the palace at Harrowgate was preparing for Founders' Day, which is the oldest ceremony we keep in the kingdom of Eldermoor, older than any of the wars in the history books, older than half the wings of the palace itself. It marks the day, some 400 years back, when the first stones of Harrowgate were laid and the first crown of Eldermoor was set on a head that had earned it rather than simply inherited it. Every year the court gathers in the long gallery. The doors are thrown open to as many ordinary subjects as the courtyard can hold, and my grandfather, King Alaric, stands before all of them and does two things. He renews, in a few solemn words, the old promise the crown makes to the people it serves. And he honors by name one or two members of the household or the guard whose service that year has been judged worthy of the Cross of Valor, the highest decoration the crown can give someone who is not a soldier fighting a war, but who has, in some quieter way, given everything duty asked of him. I had watched this ceremony every year of my life from a gallery seat beside my mother, Princess Elara, my little sister Malin fidgeting on one side of me, and my baby brother Bram usually asleep on the other by the time the trumpet sounded. I had always loved it and never once been afraid of it, because it had never once asked anything of me except to sit still and watch. That year it asked something more. I was 11, which in most families means very little, but in mine it apparently meant I had grown old enough to be trusted with a role. My grandfather told me himself in his study, with my father Crown Prince Rowan standing by the window with his arms folded in the particular way he stands when he is proud of something, and trying not to show it too plainly. I would stand at my grandfather's right hand during the Cross of Valor presentation. I would carry the small velvet box that held the medal itself, hold it steady while he spoke the citation, and at the correct moment, a nod, nothing more, I would open the box and present it to him so he could lift the cross out and place it in the guard's hands himself. It sounds like very little, my grandfather told me, and it is very little in the sense that it takes almost no strength and no cleverness. But it is not nothing, Torin. Every eye in that gallery will be on the box in your hands, waiting to see if they shake. I said that sounded fine. I did not mean it. I have never been a good liar, but I have always been a very determined one, and at 11 I had not yet learned that the two are not the same thing. For 2 weeks I could not sleep properly. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. I mean I lay awake running the ceremony over and over in my mind, imagining the box slipping from my fingers, imagining my hands trembling in front of 400 people, and every soul in Eldermoor who would later see the drawings and the accounts of it, imagining my grandfather's face when I failed him in front of the one crowd in the world he most needed to see the crown looking strong. I did not tell anyone this. Rowan and Elara are not unkind parents. They are, if anything, too observant, and I was terrified that if I said the word afraid out loud to either of them, it would become a fact rather than a feeling, something written down somewhere, something that would follow me. I had already understood, without anyone teaching me directly, that princes are permitted to be many things but are not especially encouraged to be afraid. Or if we are afraid, we are expected to arrange our faces so no one can tell. So instead of saying anything, I did what frightened children have always done in old houses with too many rooms. I disappeared into the ones nobody used. The rehearsals did not help. Twice a week I was walked through the ceremony in the empty long gallery by a tutor named Master Call, a thin, exacting man who cared, I think honestly, about getting the details right, and who had absolutely no instinct at all for a frightened boy. He would have me practice holding the box, an ordinary wooden box, weighted with sand to match the real one, since the real cross of valor was kept elsewhere until the day itself, walking the 11 measured steps to my grandfather's dais, standing through the reading of a citation, which he read aloud himself in a flat, unhelpful voice, and opening the box on his count. I dropped it twice in the first week. Both times Master Call said, not unkindly, "Again, Your Highness," and both times I felt something in my chest pull tighter. It was after the second time I dropped it that I first wandered into the East Service corridor. I want to be honest about why. It was not at first about the guard at all. I simply could not bear one more minute in that gallery with the box in my hands, and when Master Call turned to consult his schedule, I did what I had done since I was small enough to hide under the map table in the nursery. I slipped away through the nearest door and kept walking until the sound of anyone looking for me had faded behind stone. The East Service corridor runs behind the old guardroom wing, a stretch of the palace built centuries before anyone thought to make it comfortable, all narrow windows and worn flagstones, and it had fallen mostly out of use once the newer guardrooms were built closer to the main gate a generation ago. A few storerooms still opened off it. An old chapel, deconsecrated and empty, sat at the far end, its door usually locked. I had discovered it 2 winters before, chasing a cat that Malin swore had gotten in through a window, and I had gone back a handful of times since simply because it was quiet in a way almost nowhere else in Harrowgate was quiet, and because no one ever thought to look for me there. That afternoon, I sat on the cold stone step outside the old chapel door with my knees pulled up to my chest, and my heart still going too fast from the rehearsal. And I had been there perhaps 10 minutes, doing nothing in particular except breathing, when I heard 2 men's voices coming from the old guardroom antechamber just around the corner. I want to say, in my own defense, that I did not creep closer meaning to eavesdrop. I told myself I was only curious who else knew this forgotten stretch of the palace existed. That was true as far as it went. What is also true is that some instinct in me, some instinct I have thought about a great deal since, recognized before I understood it that the voices did not sound like any voices I had ever heard in the palace before. They were not performing anything. They did not have the careful, rounded shape that every voice around me took on the moment it addressed a member of the royal family, or even the moment it merely suspected one might be listening. I crept to the corner of the corridor, where a half-open door let a wedge of lamplight fall across the flagstones, and I looked. 2 guardsmen sat on an old bench against the far wall of the antechamber, out of their formal posture entirely, the way soldiers sit when they believe themselves alone. Their tunics were open at the collar. One of them, an older man with gray at his temples and a face that looked as though it had spent 40 years being patient, had his rifle leaning against the wall beside him rather than at his shoulder. The younger of the 2, younger to my 11-year-old eyes, though I would later learn he was well past his 30th year, sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and it was his voice I had heard first. "I keep telling Alaric it's not the honor I want," he was saying. "I've told him twice now. And he keeps telling me it's not up to me what I want." The older man, Alaric, I would come to know, made a low sound that might have been a laugh. "It generally isn't," he said. "That's rather the nature of an honor. Nobody consults you on whether you deserve it. Somebody decides you did something worth remembering, and then you either stand there and let them say so, or you make a scene refusing a medal in front of the whole court, which I promise you is a worse conversation than the one we're having now." I didn't do anything that night that any of us wouldn't have done. That's what everyone who deserves one says. It's usually the surest sign they do. I did not know yet who he was, or what knight or what medal. I only knew that something in the younger guardsman's voice, a kind of plain, unguarded discomfort, entirely without performance, held me at that corner far longer than good sense should have allowed. I had never, not once in my life, heard an adult sound like that. Every grown voice I knew had a public shape to it, myself included by that age. This one did not. It simply sounded like a man saying a true thing to another man he trusted, in a room he believed was empty of anyone who mattered. "I'm not good at being looked at," the younger guardsman said. "I never have been. I can stand a post for 6 hours in the rain and not move a muscle, and somehow that's easy. Somebody wants to shake my hand and say a kind word about it in front of 400 people, and I'd rather stand the 6 hours again." "I know it," Alaric said, and there was real gentleness in it, the kind that does not need to raise itself to be heard. "But you'll do it anyway, because it isn't only for you." "No," the younger man agreed quietly. "It never is." A door somewhere down the corridor behind me swung shut on its own weight, with a bang loud enough that I nearly cried out. I did not wait to hear anything more. I turned and half ran, half walked the length of the service corridor and back out into the part of the palace where I was supposed to be, my heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the ceremony anymore. And I did not, that day, learn the young guardsman's name. It took me 4 more days to learn it, and I am ashamed to say I went looking. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy for me, telling this now, to make myself sound wiser at 11 than I was, to say that I understood immediately I had stumbled onto something important and set out with some clear purpose to understand it. That is not true. What is true is that I was a frightened, restless boy who had, for exactly 1 afternoon, forgotten to be frightened, because something else had briefly filled the space fear usually occupied. I wanted that feeling again. I did not examine it more closely than that. So twice more that week I told Master Call I needed the washroom, or claimed a headache to my tutor Miss Alden during history, and each time I made my way back to the same corner of the East Service corridor, and each time I found the antechamber empty and silent, the lamp unlit, nothing but dust and an old bench and the sound of my own disappointed breathing. I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, or that the 2 guardsmen had simply moved to some other quiet corner of the palace the way I had, and that I would never find them again. On the 5th day I did. I heard the voices before I reached the corner this time, and I made myself stop several paces back, in the shadow of an old stone archway, close enough to hear but too far, I told myself, to properly count as listening at a door. It is a distinction I no longer believe holds any weight at all, but it mattered to me then, the way children build small rules to make themselves feel less guilty about things they have already decided to do. And my father would have laughed himself sick to see it, the younger guardsman was saying, and there was something looser in his voice this time, something almost like the beginning of a smile carried on words alone. Corwin Aldridge, standing in front of the king to be told he did something worth remembering. He'd have said I only did what any decent man does when he sees a family in trouble, and he'd have been right, and he still would have laughed himself sick. I had a name now, Corwin. I turned it over silently while he kept talking, the way you turn over a stone you found and want to keep. "Your father sounds like he'd have gotten on well with mine," Alaric said. "Mine used to say the same thing about every soldier who ever got a medal pinned on him. Said the ones who go looking for the ribbon rarely deserve it, and the ones who deserve it are generally trying to hide behind the man standing next to them when they call the name. That's not far off what happened at the reading of the list, if I'm honest. I nearly asked the adjutant to read someone else's name by mistake. He'd have noticed. He might not have. I can be very convincing when I want something badly enough." There was a pause, and I heard the scrape of a boot against stone, And then Corwin's voice again, quieter, the loose almost smile gone out of it. It isn't that I don't think it matters what happened that night. I think about it most days if I'm honest with you. I just don't much like the idea of the whole court watching me, while a boy hands me a box with a medal in it, like it's a performance instead of a memory. I did not understand, standing in that archway with my back pressed to cold stone, that the boy he meant without knowing it might very well be me. I found out 3 days later, and not in the corridor at all, but at my grandfather's own dinner table, which is a strange place to learn something that changes you, but that is where it happened. It was a small family supper, just my grandfather, my parents, and myself. Malin and Bram were already asleep, being younger, and my grandfather was in the particular mood he sometimes fell into before Founder's Day, half in the present and half already standing in the long gallery in his mind. He was telling my father about the citation he meant to read that year, and it was only because I had begun, without quite meaning to, listening more carefully to every mention of the ceremony that I caught the name at all. Guardsman Corwin Aldridge, my grandfather said, turning his glass slowly by the stem. 20 years of service this spring, and not one black mark against him in all of it. I have been meaning to see him properly honored for a long while now, and I finally stopped letting the paperwork get in the way of doing it. I set down my fork. Corwin Aldridge, I repeated, before I had decided to say anything at all. My grandfather looked at me with mild surprise. You know the name. I did not know how to answer that without admitting where I had heard it, so I said the safest true thing I could find. I think I've seen him on post, near the old wing. Very likely, my grandfather said, satisfied with that, and went back to his glass. He was posted there a great deal years ago, before they moved most of the standing guard nearer the main gate. He was posted there the night my mother died. The table went quiet in the particular way it always did when anyone mentioned my great-grandmother, the old Queen Mother Rosalind, who I had never known. She had died a decade and more before I was born, but whose name still carried weight in every room of Harrowgate that remembered her, the way certain names do in old houses. He kept her door that night, my grandfather said, more to my father than to me, though I was listening with my whole body. Stood it straight through till morning, when the physicians finally came out and told us what we already knew. I remember him because he was the only steady thing in that corridor. Everyone else was either weeping or trying too hard not to. He simply stood. I have never forgotten it, and I don't imagine I ever will. My father asked something about the citation wording, and the conversation moved on to matters of protocol I did not follow, but I sat very still, turning the coincidence over in my mind like a coin I could not stop touching. The guardsman with the loose almost smile in his voice, the one who did not want to be looked at, the one whose father would have laughed himself sick. That was the same man who had stood outside a dying woman's door while the rest of the palace fell apart around him, and had not moved. I did not sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the fear I had been carrying about the box and the 11 measured steps. This one had a shape closer to hunger. I went back to the East Corridor 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, and I will not pretend every visit yielded something. Twice, the antechamber was empty. Once I arrived just as the 2 men were leaving, and I had to duck into the old chapel doorway and hold my breath as their boots passed within a few feet of where I stood pressed flat against the stone, my heart so loud in my own ears I was certain they would hear it. But 3 times I found them there, unhurried in the last hour before the evening watch change, talking the way men talk who have shared a great deal of silence together, and have therefore earned the right to say almost anything. On one of those afternoons, I learned about Corwin's father. He worked the high pastures above Eldermoor, Corwin was saying, of a village I had never heard named in any lesson, tucked somewhere in the folded hill country north of the capital. Sheep, mostly, and what little grain the ground up there would give him. It was not an easy life, and he never once complained of it in front of me, though I found out later from my mother that there were winters he went without so the rest of us wouldn't have to. "That's a particular kind of man," Alaric said. "It is. And I didn't understand it at the time. You don't at that age. You just think that's simply how fathers are. But I understood it a great deal better the winter I was 9, when he took a fall on the ice bringing the flock down and broke his leg badly enough that he couldn't work it for the better part of 4 months. We should have starved that winter, or come close to it. My mother would tell you we very nearly did." "What happened?" "A guardsman happened," Corwin said, and I could hear, even from the corner where I stood, that something had changed in his voice, some old feeling surfacing that had clearly been carried a long way and set down carefully many times before, the way you carry something you don't want to chip. There was a small garrison posted near Eldermoor in those years, keeping the Old North Road, nothing to do with the palace really, just soldiers doing a dull job in a cold place. One of them, I never learned his given name, my father only ever called him Sergeant Voss, used to walk the road past our croft on his rounds. He noticed, I suppose, that the chimney wasn't smoking the way it should for that time of year, or that there wasn't enough livestock moving in the yard, or whatever it is a man like that learns to notice. And he started leaving things. Never announced, never spoken of. A sack of grain left inside the gate at first light. Once, a whole side of salted mutton, which I know now must have cost him something real on a soldier's pay. He fixed our roof himself one week when it was leaking badly enough to soak the one dry room we had left, climbed up there in his own time, off duty, in weather no sensible man climbs a roof in, and never said a word about it to my father except that he happened to have a free afternoon and nothing better to do with it. Did your father ever thank him properly? He tried. Sergeant Voss wouldn't hear it. Told him, and I remember this because my father repeated it to me more times than I could count for the rest of his life. Told him that a man doesn't get thanked for doing the plain, decent thing. He just does it, and moves on to the next thing that needs doing. My father used to say it was the first time in his life anyone had shown him that duty and kindness could be the exact same act, wearing the exact same uniform. There was a silence then, long enough that I nearly gave myself away, leaning forward to hear whether it would break. "I was 9 years old watching a stranger fix our roof for no reason he'd admit to," Corwin said finally, "and I decided that day, though it took me another 12 years to do anything about it, that I wanted to be the kind of man who could do that for somebody. Not the medals, not the uniform even, not really. Just the roof, the sack of grain nobody had to ask for. My father never got the chance to thank Sergeant Voss the way he wanted to. I've spent 20 years trying to be, for somebody, whatever that man was for us, so that the debt gets paid forward if it can't be paid back." "And the night at the old Queen Mother's door," Alaric said gently, "was that the roof and the grain sack too?" "I don't know how else to explain it," Corwin said. "I couldn't fix anything that night. Nobody could. All I could do was be the one steady thing in a corridor full of people who loved her and were breaking apart with it, so that when they needed somewhere to rest their eyes that wasn't falling to pieces, there was somewhere. That's all it was. It felt like nothing at the time. It still mostly feels like nothing. I only stood still. I walked back to my lessons that afternoon by a longer route than I needed to, so that I would have more time before anyone saw my face and asked me why I looked the way I must have looked. The rehearsals did not get easier exactly, but I noticed something had shifted in how I carried them. I still dropped the weighted box once more that week, and Master Call still said again, "Your Highness," in his flat, unhelpful voice, and my hands still went cold every time I pictured the long gallery full to its high windows with people. But underneath the fear now there was something else. Some small, stubborn thread of curiosity pulling me back toward that corridor whenever I could steal the time, and I have come to think, looking back on it, That curiosity is very often the thing that finally gets a frightened person moving when fear alone would have kept them frozen forever. I went back 9 days before Founders Day and found them speaking of something I did not expect at all, which was Corwin's son. He turned 6 in the winter, Corwin was saying, and this time there was no loose almost smile in his voice at all, only a kind of tired, careful tenderness, the sound of a man handling a subject he has learned to be gentle with because it can still hurt him if he isn't. 6 years old, and I have been present for perhaps half of his birthdays if I count generously. The posting rotations don't ask a man what his son needs. They ask what the crown needs, and rightly so. That's the job. I signed up for the job with my eyes open. But there are mornings I think about it, and it sits on me harder than any post I've ever stood. Does he understand it? Alaric asked. He understands I go away and come back. I'm not certain a 6-year-old is meant to understand more than that, and some days I think I'm grateful he doesn't have to. My wife carries the weight of explaining the rest of it, and she never once complains to me about it, which somehow makes me feel it more, not less. He drew me a picture before I left this last rotation. A guardsman, badly drawn, all arms and no proportion to speak of, standing very straight next to a house with smoke coming out of the chimney. I asked him who it was, and he said, "You, keeping us warm." I have never in 20 years of standing posts in whether that would kill a lesser man felt anything the way that sentence went through me. You kept the drawing. I keep every drawing. I have a box of them at the garrison, if you can believe a man my age keeps a box of his son's drawings under his bunk like a schoolboy with love letters. I look at them on the nights the post feels long. It helps more than you'd think, remembering there's a boy somewhere who thinks I keep a house warm just by existing in it. That's not so far from what you're being given a medal for, is it? Alaric said. Keeping something warm just by standing there. Corwin was quiet a moment. I hadn't thought of it that way. I don't much like thinking of it in any way that makes it sound larger than it was. It was one night. He's given every day since. That doesn't feel like a fair trade to put in front of a room full of people. Nobody's asking you to think it's a fair trade. They're asking you to let them say thank you. I know it, Corwin said again, the same phrase he had used once before, and I was beginning to understand that it was a kind of private surrender he allowed himself only with Alaric, an admission that he had been talked past his own resistance and had decided, this once, not to fight it further. I thought, walking away from the corridor that day, about my own father, about the fact that Rowan had never once, in my entire life, been absent from anything that mattered to me. Not a single birthday, not a single scraped knee, not a single bad dream that sent me down the hall to my parents' door in the middle of the night. I had never once had reason to wonder whether my father would be there, because he always simply was. I had taken that so entirely for granted that it had never once occurred to me it might be a kind of luck, rather than simply the ordinary shape of the world. Corwin's son had a drawing of a guardsman standing very straight next to a warm house, made by a boy who saw his father perhaps half the days a boy should. I did not know, at 11, quite what to do with the shame that came with that thought, so I mostly just carried it, the way I had begun carrying a great many things that spring without telling anyone I was carrying them. It was 6 days before Founders Day that I finally heard him speak of fear directly, and it is, of everything I overheard in that corridor, the piece I have returned to most often in the years since, on nights when I have needed it. I won't pretend to you I wasn't afraid that night, Corwin was saying, and I knew from the particular stillness in his voice, the careful, unhurried pacing of it, that he meant the night outside the old Queen Mother's door. Everyone assumes, because I stood there and didn't move, that I wasn't feeling anything at all. That's not true. I was 22 years old and I had never stood a post like that in my life, and I was terrified the entire time. Terrified I'd do something wrong, terrified I'd fail some test nobody had told me the rules of, terrified, if I'm honest, of the grief in that corridor itself, the sheer size of it, because I'd never been that close to something so large before. "You didn't look it," Alaric said. "That was rather the point," Corwin said, and there was the ghost of dry humor in it now, worn thin by the years but still present. "Nobody is served by a guard who looks the way he feels in a moment like that. The family needed something steady to look at. It wasn't my job to give them my fear. It was my job to give them stillness and manage the fear somewhere they couldn't see it." How does a 22-year-old manage terror like that and still stand straight for 6 hours? "Badly at first," Corwin admitted, and I heard him shift on the bench, the old wood creaking under him. "I nearly didn't manage it at all in the first hour. My hands were shaking so badly inside my gloves I thought surely someone would see it. And once you start believing someone can see your fear, the fear gets worse, feeds on itself. What saved me, if anything did, was something my father told me long before I ever thought of joining the guard. He wasn't a soldier, I've told you that. He was a shepherd, but shepherds understand fear too, in their own way, standing out on a hillside in a storm with nothing between them and it but their own 2 feet. He told me once that fear isn't a thing you get rid of. Anyone who tells you they've gotten rid of it is either lying to you or lying to themselves. Fear is a thing you carry alongside whatever else you're carrying, and the trick isn't making it go away. The trick is making sure it doesn't get to hold the reins. "And how do you do that?" "I picked one point," Corwin said. "That night, it was a particular seam in the stone across the corridor, just above head height, where 2 courses of the old wall didn't quite line up true. I fixed my eyes on it and I didn't let them wander, because the moment my eyes wandered, I started seeing the faces in that corridor, and the faces were where the fear lived. And I breathed slower than felt natural, in through the nose for a long count, out even longer because panic breathes fast and shallow, and if you make your body breathe the way a calm man breathes, sometimes the rest of you starts believing the lie before your mind has caught up to it. And I told myself over and over the same handful of words until they were the only thing left in my head with any room in it. Not tonight. Not while I'm standing here. Whatever this feeling wants to do, it can do it after when I'm off the post and no one needs me steady anymore. Tonight, it waits its turn." "Did it work?" "It worked enough," Corwin said. "I stood the post. I didn't disgrace myself or the uniform. And when I came off watch at dawn, I went and sat by myself in the stable yard for the better part of an hour and let every bit of it out that I'd been holding back all night, and no one saw that part, and no one needed to. That's the whole of it, really. That's the entire secret, if you want to call it a secret. You don't need to not be afraid. You only need somewhere to put it until the moment is finished asking something of you, and the discipline not to let it out early." I stood in the shadow of that old archway with my back against the cold stone and my own heart going very fast, and I thought of the box of sand-weighted wood I had dropped twice in front of Master Call, and I thought that perhaps I had been trying to solve the wrong problem the entire time. I had been trying to make the fear disappear before Founder's Day arrived, willing myself calm by sheer determination and mostly failing at it. Corwin was telling Alaric, without knowing that a third person in the corridor needed to hear it more than either of them did, that the fear was never going to disappear, and that disappearing it was never actually the job. I do not know how long I stood there turning that over. Long enough, at any rate, that I stopped listening carefully to my own feet. A loose stone under my heel shifted with a scrape that sounded, in that narrow corridor, like a small avalanche. I froze. The voices in the antechamber stopped at once, and I heard, with a lurch of pure animal panic, the unmistakable sound of a bench scraping back and boots crossing stone toward the doorway. There was nowhere to run that would not have made noise of its own, so I did the only thing my body seemed able to do, which was to stand perfectly still, exactly where I was, in plain view of the archway the moment Corwin came around it. He stopped short. I watched something move across his face very quickly, surprise first, then a kind of rapid, calculating alarm, the look of a man doing sums about how much trouble he might be in and how fast. And only after that, when he had taken in the rest of me, the fine cloth of my coat, the signet ring my grandfather had given me on my last birthday, which I had forgotten I was even wearing, something that might have been recognition, and beneath the recognition, something that looked almost like dread. "Your Highness," he said, and the word came out of him strangely, half question and half apology, as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing and hoped very much to be wrong about it. I said nothing. I have never in my life, before or since, been so completely unable to produce a single word. Alaric appeared in the doorway behind him a moment later, took one look at the scene, and had the good sense to say nothing at all, though I saw his eyes go from me to Corwin and back again, and I understood, even in my panic, that he was doing the same sums Corwin was. "How long have you?" Corwin started, and then stopped himself, visibly, the way a man stops himself from asking a question he already suspects he doesn't want answered honestly. He straightened instead, and something in his whole bearing changed in front of me, the loose, unguarded man from the bench folding itself away and a different man taking his place, upright, formal, correct in every line, the way I imagine he stood the night outside my great-grandmother's door. "This is not a part of the palace you ought to be in unaccompanied, Your Highness. Shall I escort you back to your household?" I found my voice finally, though it came out smaller than I meant it to. "I know the way back." "All the same," he said, and it was not a request. He walked me back through the old wing in a silence that felt, to me, like the longest walk I had ever taken in that palace, though it could not have been more than 4 or 5 minutes by the clock. He did not scold me. He did not ask what I had heard, or how long I had been coming, or why. He simply walked one careful pace behind and to the side of me, the exact correct distance an escorting guard keeps, and delivered me to the corridor outside my tutor's schoolroom, and bowed and said, "Your Highness," again, in a voice with nothing at all left in it of the man I had been listening to for 2 weeks, and turned and walked away before I had thought of a single thing to say to him. I did not know, standing there watching his back recede down the corridor, that he had already decided, by the time he reached the antechamber again, that his duty required him to report where he had found me. He did not tell them what I had heard. I want to be clear about that, because I did not understand it at the time, and it took me a long while afterward to appreciate what it must have cost him to make that distinction cleanly, under pressure, in the moment. He told my tutor, and through her my mother, only that he had come upon me alone in a disused part of the palace I had no business being in, and that as a matter of proper protocol he felt obligated to report it, so that whatever precautions the household thought necessary could be taken. That was all. He said nothing of the antechamber conversations, nothing of what a prince might have overheard there, nothing that would have made the matter about anything other than a wandering boy and an unlocked wing that perhaps needed locking. It did not feel like a small mercy to me at the time. At the time it felt like the end of the entire world I had been quietly building for myself over 2 weeks. My mother was not angry with me in the way I had feared. Elara has never once in my whole life raised her voice at me, but she was serious in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have, sitting across from me in her sitting room with her hands folded and her eyes steady on my face. "You've been slipping away from your lessons," she said. It was not a question. I could have lied, I nearly did. But something about the last 2 weeks, about the voice in the corridor telling Alaric that fear isn't a thing you get rid of, made lying feel suddenly like a much heavier weight to carry than the truth would be. So instead I told her, not everything, not what I had overheard. Some instinct I could not have named kept that part locked behind my teeth. But I told her that the ceremony frightened me badly, that I had been terrified of dropping the box in front of the whole court, that I had gone looking for somewhere quiet to be alone with it, and that I had found the old wing instead of a solution. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have never forgotten. You could have told me you were frightened, Torin. That was always allowed. I didn't want anyone to know. Why not? I did not have a good answer for that at 11, and I am not entirely certain I have a better one now, except to say that some fears feel too large and too shameful to hand to the people who love you most, because you are afraid of what it will mean about you if they see the whole size of it. She did not punish me harshly. My lessons were rearranged so that I had less unsupervised time between them, and a member of the household staff was assigned to walk me between the schoolroom and the long gallery for rehearsals, which felt, to an 11-year-old, like the deepest possible humiliation, even though I understood, somewhere underneath the humiliation, that it was a reasonable and even gentle response to what I had actually done. What hurt more than any of that, though, was simpler and smaller and entirely my own fault. The East Service corridor was, from that day forward, closed to me, not by any locked door but by the plain fact that I no longer had the freedom to reach it. And even if I had, I did not know how I could possibly face Corwin Aldridge again after the look that had crossed his face when he found me standing in that archway. I told myself in the days that followed a great many things to make the loss feel smaller than it was. I told myself I had learned what I needed to learn already, that the lesson about fear was complete in itself, that I did not need anything further from a man I had, after all, spied on for 2 weeks without his knowledge or consent. None of that made the ache in my chest any smaller. I had found, quite by accident, the one honest voice in a palace full of careful, guarded ones, and I had ruined it through my own carelessness. And worse, I had very likely made Corwin Aldridge, a man about to be honored publicly for exactly this kind of quiet, unclaimed decency, feel that his private grief and his private fear had been stolen from him by a boy who had no right to either. The rehearsals in the days that followed were worse than they had been before, not better, which surprised me, because I had expected the fear management he had described to Alaric to fix something in me the moment I tried applying it. It did not at first. I fixed my eyes on a seam in the stone of the long gallery wall the way he had fixed his on that seam outside my great-grandmother's door, and I breathed slow the way he had described breathing, and I still dropped the box a third time, 3 days before the ceremony, in front of Master Call, and on that particular afternoon, my grandfather himself, who had come to observe. The wooden box struck the polished floor with a crack that seemed to echo the length of the empty gallery, and I stood over it with my face burning and my eyes stinging in a way I refused, absolutely refused, to let become anything worse in front of my grandfather, and I heard him cross the floor toward me with his slow, unhurried tread. "Pick it up," he said, not unkindly, and when I had, he crouched my grandfather, King of Eldermoor, crouching on the floor of his own long gallery to meet my eyes at their own height, and said, "Torin, look at me." I looked at him. "Whatever is happening in your hands," he said, "is not happening because you are weak or because you will fail me on the day itself. It is happening because you understand correctly that the moment matters. A boy who felt nothing would never drop the box. I would be far more worried about that boy than I am about you." It was kind, and I have thought of it many times since as a genuinely kind thing for a busy king to stop and say to a frightened grandson. But it was not, in the end, the thing that reached me, because my grandfather did not know, could not have known, what I had heard in that corridor, or that somewhere inside the fear I was carrying was also the shape of a man's voice explaining that the trick was never making the fear disappear, only finding somewhere to put it until the moment released him from duty. My grandfather's kindness told me I was not wrong to be afraid. It did not tell me what to do with the fear once I had admitted to having it, and admitting to having it, I discovered in the days that followed, is only the very first and easiest part of the problem. 3 days before Founder's Day, lying awake again with the ceremony pressing down on me and the ache of the closed corridor pressing down beside it, I decided I was going to do something I had never once, in my whole sheltered life, done on my own initiative before. I was going to find a way to speak to Corwin Aldridge directly and tell him the truth and ask his forgiveness, whatever the cost of asking turned out to be. I did not know, lying there in the dark working up the courage for it, that it would turn out to be one of the harder things I have ever done, and that it would also, in the end, be the thing that made everything that came after possible. The trouble was that an 11-year-old prince with a household escort, now attached to nearly every hour of his day, does not have an easy way to simply seek out a guardsman for a private word. I considered and discarded a dozen plans over the course of that sleepless night, writing a letter and having it delivered, which felt cowardly the moment I thought of it, since it would let me say the hard thing without having to watch his face while I said it. Asking my father to arrange a meeting, which felt worse, since it would mean explaining to Rowan far more than I was ready to explain. Simply waiting in the corridor near the guardroom where Corwin was rostered and hoping for a chance encounter, which felt both hopeless, given my new escort, and faintly ridiculous, given that it was more or less the exact behavior that had caused the entire problem. In the end, it was Alaric who solved it for me, though I did not know that was what had happened until much later. 2 days before Founder's Day, my new household escort, a kind, unhurried woman named Mrs. Pell, who had clearly been briefed to keep me firmly on schedule and firmly accompanied, walked me to the long gallery for what was meant to be my final rehearsal before the ceremony itself. Master Call was waiting, as always, with the weighted box. But standing a little apart from him, in full uniform, was Alaric, and I understood at once, with a lurch of nerves, that he had been assigned as one of the standing guards for the rehearsal, likely for the very good reason that he would also be on duty for the ceremony proper. He said nothing to me during the rehearsal itself, correctly, formally, exactly as a guard on post should conduct himself in front of royalty he is not personally acquainted with. But as Master Call gathered his papers afterward and Mrs. Pell stepped out to confer with him about the schedule, Alaric crossed the gallery floor toward me, unhurried, and said quietly, in a voice pitched for me alone, "You did not hear this from me, Your Highness. But if a boy wished to have a word with a certain guardsman before Founder's Day, that guardsman generally takes his supper break alone in the small courtyard behind the armory, 6:30, before the evening watch. It's rarely occupied by anyone else at that hour." I stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" Alaric's face did not change much, but something in his eyes did. "Because he has not been himself since the day he found you in that corridor, and I have known him long enough to know that whatever weight he's carrying about it, he'd rather set it down honestly than carry it quietly into a ceremony that's already asking a great deal of him. I don't know precisely what happened between the two of you, and I haven't asked. But I know a man in trouble with himself when I see one, and I thought perhaps you might be in a similar condition." I did not know what to say to that, so I only nodded, and he inclined his head, not quite a bow, something more like the courtesy one gives a person one has decided to trust, and returned to his post before Mrs. Pell came back into the gallery. It took me the better part of that day, and the whole of the next, to work out how to slip free of Mrs. Pell for even 20 minutes without alarming her enough to raise the matter with my mother. And I will admit that some of the plotting involved was not entirely honest. I told her I wished to walk the small kitchen garden alone before supper to settle my nerves, which was true as far as it went, and did not mention that the kitchen garden shared a low connecting gate with the courtyard behind the armory, a fact I happened to know from years of childhood exploring that I was, for once, grateful to have. I found him exactly where Alaric had said he would be, sitting alone on an overturned crate near the armory's back wall, a plain supper of bread and cold meat mostly untouched on a cloth beside him, staring at nothing in particular. He heard the gate and looked up, and I watched the same rapid alarm cross his face that had crossed it in the corridor, the sums running behind his eyes again. Was I meant to be here? Was he now in trouble simply for my presence? Should he escort me away at once? "Please don't send me back yet," I said before he could speak, the words coming out in a rush I had not entirely planned. I know I'm not supposed to be here. I know that better than anyone. I only need a few minutes, and then I'll go, and I won't come looking for you again after that, I promise. He set down the bread he had half raised and stood correctly, and bowed the small formal bow protocol required. Your Highness. Please don't do that either, I said, and I heard my own voice crack slightly on it, which embarrassed me terribly but which I have since come to think may have been the thing that actually reached him, because something in his face eased, very slightly, the way a held breath eases. I didn't come here to make you stand at attention in front of me. I came to say I'm sorry. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I could not entirely read. Sorry for what, exactly, Your Highness? For listening, I said, for all of it. I found that corridor by accident, the first time. I promise you that part is true. I wasn't looking for anyone to spy on. But after that first afternoon, I kept going back on purpose, because I liked hearing you talk to Alaric, because it was the only honest thing I'd heard from a grown person in longer than I can remember, and I knew the whole time it wasn't mine to listen to, and I did it anyway, and then I got caught because I wasn't careful enough, and I know I made you feel like something private got taken from you right before the whole court is going to be watching you receive a medal for it. I've thought about that every day since, and I wanted to tell you myself instead of just being sorry from a distance and hoping you'd hear about it secondhand. Corwin did not say anything for what felt to me like a very long time. He looked at me the way I imagine he had once looked at that seam in the stone outside my great-grandmother's door, steady, unhurried, giving himself the time he needed before he answered. May I sit back down, Your Highness? He said finally. This feels like the sort of conversation a man ought to have sitting, rather than standing. I nodded, and he sat back on the crate, and after a moment's hesitation I sat myself on the low stone wall across from him, close enough to talk plainly but not so close as to crowd him, though I do not think, at 11, I understood consciously why I chose the distance I did. I simply felt, somehow, that it mattered. I wasn't angry at you, he said. I want you to hear that first, because I suspect you've spent the last several days believing I was, and I should have found a way to tell you sooner that it wasn't true. What you heard in me that day in the corridor, when I found you standing there, that wasn't anger. It was fear of a different kind than the fear I've told Alaric about 100 times. It was the fear of having said something private in a place I believed was safe, and finding out it hadn't been, and not knowing yet what that would mean for me, whether I'd done something wrong simply by talking freely near a corridor where a prince might wander through. That's the sum I was doing behind my face if you saw it. Not anger at you, fear for myself. I'm sorry for that too, I said, for putting that fear in you. You didn't put it there on purpose, and I don't hold a boy of 11 to the same account I'd hold a grown man to for wandering somewhere he shouldn't have and hearing more than he meant to. What I've been sitting with these last days isn't anger at you at all, if I'm honest with myself about it. It's something closer to, he paused, searching for the word, exposure, I suppose. I've spent 20 years learning to say the true things only where I judged it safe to say them, only to Alaric, only in a corner of the palace nobody uses anymore, precisely because I don't much like the idea of the whole court hearing what's actually inside me when they'd rather just see the uniform standing straight. And then I find out a prince has been standing in the shadow of that same corner for 2 weeks, hearing every word of it, and it made me feel smaller, somehow, than I've felt in a long while. Not because you did anything cruel with what you heard. Because I hadn't chosen to hand it to you, and a man likes to choose who he hands the true parts of himself to. I understood that, or thought I did, more fully than I might have a month earlier, before I had spent 2 weeks learning what it cost him to say those things even to a trusted friend behind a closed door. I never told anyone what I heard, I said. Not my mother, not my grandfather, not anyone. I only told the household that I'd wandered where I shouldn't have. I didn't say anything about you or Emeric or what either of you talked about. I wanted you to know that. I know it doesn't undo the listening, but I didn't take it and use it for anything. I only kept it because it helped me, more than you probably know. Something shifted in his face at that, a kind of careful, searching attention. Helped you how? I told him then, haltingly at first, and then with more of a rush as the words found their own momentum. About the box I kept dropping, about the fear that had been keeping me awake for weeks, about how ashamed I had been of that fear, how certain I had been that admitting it to anyone would mark me as unfit for what was coming. Unfit, somehow, for the crown I would carry someday, even though that day was a long way off. I told him about the seam in the stone I had tried fixing my eyes on, the slow counted breathing, the handful of words I had tried repeating to myself in the empty gallery. Not tonight, not while I'm standing here, and how none of it had worked cleanly yet, and how I had begun to think perhaps it simply did not work for people like me, boys instead of grown guardsmen, princes instead of soldiers. When I finished, Corwin was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had lost the careful formality it had carried since the corridor, and had gone back, unmistakably, to the voice I had first heard through a half-open door 2.5 weeks before, the voice that did not perform, that simply told the truth because it had decided the truth was worth telling. "It doesn't work cleanly for anyone, Your Highness," he said. "Not the first time, not the 10th time if I'm honest with you. I've stood 100 posts since that night outside your great-grandmother's door, and there are still afternoons my hands aren't as steady as I'd like them to be before I take up my rifle. The technique isn't a spell. It doesn't make the fear vanish the moment you use it correctly. All it does, all it has ever done for me, is give the fear somewhere to stand that isn't directly in front of your hands. That's all. Some days it does that well. Some days it barely does it at all, and you get through the post anyway, on nothing but stubbornness and the knowledge that the moment will eventually end. How do you know when it's working then? You don't always. You only know afterward when you look back and realize you did the thing that needed doing, whether or not it felt steady while you were doing it. That's the part nobody tells you when you're young. Steadiness isn't a feeling most of the time. It's a choice you keep making, over and over, faster than the fear can talk you out of it. Some men are lucky enough that it eventually starts to feel steady too, most of the time, after enough years of choosing it. I'm one of the lucky ones, I think, most days. But the choosing came first. The feeling came a long way after, and it still isn't reliable enough that I'd stake my post on it. I sat with that for a while, the evening light going long and gold across the courtyard wall behind him, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not settled in weeks. Not the fear leaving exactly, because it had not left. I could still feel it sitting there, patient and unmoved by anything either of us had said. But something around the fear had changed. It no longer felt like proof that I was unfit for what was coming. It felt instead like the ordinary cost of the thing being asked of me, a cost that a man 20 years into his service still paid, a cost that did not disqualify a person from duty, but was simply, unavoidably, part of what duty was made of. "Can I ask you something else?" I said, "and you can tell me if it's not my place to ask it." "You can ask. When my grandfather said you did something worth remembering the night at my great-grandmother's door, do you actually believe that? Or do you still think, the way you told Emeric, that anyone would have done it?" Corwin considered this for a long moment, longer than he had considered anything else I had asked him, and when he answered, he was looking not quite at me but at some point past my shoulder, out toward the darkening line of the palace roofs. "I believe I did the only thing I knew how to do that night, which was stand still and not fall apart in front of people who needed someone not to. I don't know if that's worth a medal, exactly. I've spent 20 years thinking it wasn't, thinking any decent man in that uniform would have managed the same. But I've come around slowly these last weeks to thinking that perhaps it doesn't matter whether any decent man would have managed it. I did manage it. And your grandfather has carried the memory of that corridor for a very long time, carried it the way a man carries the handful of things that got him through the worst night of his life. And if standing still that one night gave him something to hold on to through everything that came after, then perhaps it was worth remembering after all, whether or not I'd call it extraordinary myself. Sometimes the ordinary thing, done at the exact moment it's needed, is the extraordinary thing. I'm only beginning to let myself believe that. He looked back at me then, and something in his face had gentled entirely, the last of the guarded formality gone out of it. You should get back to your household, Your Highness, before someone starts a search for you, and we're both in a great deal more trouble than either of us can talk our way out of. I stood reluctantly. Corwin, I said his given name, without the title which I had never once used with a member of the guard in my life, and which came out of me before I had decided whether I was permitted to say it. Thank you for not being angry with me, and for talking to me honestly, even though you didn't have to. Something that was almost, but not quite, a smile crossed his face. You've a steadier look about you than you did when you walked in here, Your Highness. Whatever else comes of this, I'll take that as worth the risk we've both just taken talking to each other where we oughtn't have. I left the courtyard through the low garden gate before Mrs. Pell had time to wonder where I'd gotten to, and I walked back through the palace that evening feeling, for the first time in weeks, something closer to ready than afraid, though the two feelings I was learning did not cancel each other out so much as they learned slowly to walk beside one another. Founder's Day arrived the way I imagine most dreaded and hoped for days arrive, too slowly in the counting of it, and far too quickly once it had actually come. I woke before dawn without needing anyone to wake me, and lay in the gray early light listening to the palace already stirring around me, the distant clatter of the kitchens, the tread of household staff moving with the particular brisk purpose that only a ceremony morning produces. My mother came to help me dress herself, which she did not usually do, sending my sister's nurse in her place most days, and I understood without her saying so that she knew, in the way mothers know things without being told, that I needed her steadiness beside me that morning more than I needed anything else. You look like your father did the first year he stood beside your grandfather at this ceremony, she said, straightening the collar of my formal coat, dark blue trimmed in the silver that marks the house of Harrowgate, terrified and trying very hard not to show it. Did it get easier for him? Every year, she said, but I don't think it ever stopped mattering to him. I think that's rather the point of it. The day it stops mattering to you is the day you've stopped taking the promise seriously, and your grandfather has never once let that happen to him in 40 years of standing where you'll stand today. I thought of Corwin's words in the courtyard. Steadiness isn't a feeling most of the time, it's a choice you keep making. And I said nothing more, but I held the thought close, the way you hold something in a closed hand you don't want to accidentally drop before you need it. The long gallery, when we entered it that midday, bore almost no resemblance to the echoing empty room I had rehearsed in a dozen times with Master Call and his flat, unhelpful count. Every tall window stood open to the spring light. The doors at the far end had been thrown wide onto the courtyard beyond, and through them I could see a crowd of ordinary Eldermoor subjects gathered in the sunshine, held back by a light cordon of guards but close enough to see and hear everything, exactly as the old custom required. Founder's Day belonged to them as much as to the court, and the crown had never once, in 400 years, closed its doors to them on this single day. Inside the gallery itself, the court had assembled in their finest, rows of familiar and half-familiar faces, and at the front near the dais, I found my father Rowan already standing with my grandfather, and beyond them, near enough the dais that I understood at once the arrangement had been made deliberately, I saw Corwin. He stood at parade rest in his dress uniform, the deep palace red immaculate, Metals I had never before had cause to notice catching the light along his chest, his bearskin correct and unmoving atop his head, his face composed into the same flawless, expressionless stillness I had watched 100 guardsmen wear 100 times before without ever once wondering what sat behind it. I would never again, I realized, standing there taking him in, be able to look at that stillness and assume it meant nothing was happening underneath it. Alaric stood a short distance away, part of the small honor guard flanking the dais, and as I passed him on my way to take my place at my grandfather's right hand, I caught, for just an instant, the faintest inclination of his head toward me, not quite a nod. Nothing anyone watching would have registered as anything at all, but I understood it, and I think I managed, despite everything, the ghost of a small answering smile. My grandfather took my hand as I reached him, a small thing, not part of any rehearsed choreography, simply a grandfather's hand finding his grandson's for a moment before the ceremony proper began, and murmured, low enough that only I could hear it, "Whatever your hands do today, Torin, I will still be exactly as proud of you as I am at this moment. Remember that, whatever happens." I nodded and took the velvet box from the household officer who presented it to me on its small cushion, and felt, immediately, the old cold fear rise in my chest exactly as it had risen in every rehearsal, my fingers already anticipating the tremor they were certain was coming. The ceremony began, as it always began, with the trumpets, and then with my grandfather's voice, carrying easily across the packed gallery and out through the open doors to the crowd beyond, renewing in a few plain, unhurried sentences the ancient promise of the crown to the people of Eldermoor, that it would serve before it ruled, that it would answer to duty before it answered to its own comfort, that the crown of Harrowgate had been earned once, 4 centuries before, and must go on being earned, generation after generation, or it meant nothing at all. I had heard those words every year of my life and felt them, always as beautiful but somewhat distant, the way you feel about a story that happened to other people a long time ago. That year, for the first time, I felt them land somewhere close to where Corwin's own words had landed in the courtyard 2 evenings before, and I understood, standing there with the box growing warm and damp in my nervous hands, that the promise my grandfather was making was not so very different from the promise Corwin had made without ever using the word promise at all, to stand steady, to give the fear somewhere to wait, to let duty come first and the self come after. Then my grandfather turned, and the citations began. There were 2 honored that year before Corwin's name was called, an elderly steward retiring after 4 decades in the household, and a young physician who had worked through a fever outbreak in the lower town 2 winters before without once leaving her post, and I watched each ceremony pass in a kind of taut, waiting blur, my whole attention narrowing steadily toward the moment I knew was coming. And then my grandfather's voice changed timbre slightly, the way it always did when a citation carried particular personal weight for him, and he said, "Guardsman Corwin Aldridge, step forward." Corwin crossed the short distance to the dais and came to attention before my grandfather with a precision that made the whole gallery, for a moment, entirely silent, even the ordinary murmur of a large crowd settling instantly, the way a room settles when something genuinely solemn is about to be said rather than merely performed. My grandfather read the citation himself, from a single sheet of paper he did not, I noticed, actually need to look down at very often, because he had clearly known the words by heart long before that morning. He spoke of 20 years of unbroken service. He spoke in careful, measured, general terms, nothing that would have felt to Corwin, I think, like his grief being put on display for a crowd, only the honest shape of what had happened, of a night many years before when the household of Harrowgate had lost someone deeply loved, and of a single young guardsman who had stood a post outside a door through the whole of that night without once breaking his composure, so that in the worst hours of that family's grief, there had been one steady thing in the corridor for their eyes to rest on. He spoke of the 20 years since, unmarked by any failure of duty, and said that the crown of Eldermoor did not give the cross of valor lightly, and had waited, he admitted plainly, far too long to give this one, and meant, in giving it now, both to honor the man standing before him, and to make clear that the crown does not forget a debt merely because time has passed since it was incurred. My grandfather looked at me then, and nodded the same small, quiet nod we had rehearsed a dozen times in the empty gallery, except that nothing about the moment felt rehearsed at all. I felt the fear come up in my chest exactly as it always had, sharp and sudden, my hands already beginning, faintly, to tremble around the edges of the box. And in that instant, without deciding to, without any conscious act of will that I could afterward describe clearly, I found the seam. It was not a seam in stone. It was the sight, just past the edge of my grandfather's shoulder, of a single carved rosette in the old gallery ceiling, slightly uneven where centuries of restoration work had never quite matched the original stonemason's hand. A small, fixed, unremarkable point that had nothing whatsoever to do with the ceremony, and everything in that moment to do with keeping my eyes from wandering to the 400 faces watching me. I fixed my gaze on it. I breathed slower than felt natural, in through the nose, out longer than felt natural, the way Corwin had described breathing outside a door 16 years before I was ever born. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet but entirely clear, I heard the words he had given Alaric in that antechamber, and had, without ever quite meaning to, given to me as well. Not now. Not while I'm standing here. Whatever this wants to do, it can do it after. Right now, it waits its turn. I do not know if my hands were perfectly steady when I opened the box. I have never asked anyone who was watching that day, because I have come to think it does not matter nearly as much as I once believed it would. What I know is that I opened it, and my grandfather lifted the cross of valor from its bed of dark velvet, and turned, and placed it into Corwin Aldridge's waiting hands himself, and that Corwin, receiving it, did something that was not in any rehearsal, not part of any choreography either my grandfather or Master Call had prepared him for. He looked, for just a moment, past my grandfather's shoulder, directly at me. And he inclined his head, the smallest fraction of a bow. Nothing any of the 400 watching would have registered as anything more than a guardsman's correct courtesy to a young prince standing near the dais. And in his eyes, for that one unguarded second, I saw something that was not quite a smile and was not quite gratitude, and was, I have come to believe since, both of those things folded together with something larger that I did not yet, at 11, have a proper name for. Though I have since decided to call it simply being seen, the way I had once, quite by accident, seen him. The gallery erupted, a moment later, into the kind of warm, sustained applause that Founders' Day ceremonies rarely produce for anyone but the crown itself, and through the open doors I could hear the crowd in the courtyard beyond taking it up as well, word of the citation clearly having carried out to them on the spring air. And I stood there with the empty velvet box still open in my too steady, or nearly steady, close enough to steady that it no longer felt like the thing that mattered most, hands. And felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the fear finally, quietly, being allowed to stand down from its post, now that the moment had released it. The rest of the ceremony passed in the pleasant blur that follows any relief that large, the closing words, the second round of trumpets, the slow formal procession out through the open doors, so the crowd in the courtyard could see the court pass among them, which they did every Founders' Day, my grandfather insisting always that the promise renewed inside the gallery meant nothing if the people it was made to could not see it renewed with their own eyes. I walked near the back of that procession, no longer required to carry anything, my hands empty and free at my sides for the first time all day, and I found, walking out into the spring sunlight with the crowd's warmth washing over the whole court, that I was smiling in a way that had nothing performed about it at all. There was a reception afterward in the smaller hall adjoining the gallery, the kind of standing, murmuring gathering where the newly honored are meant to receive the congratulations of the court. and I saw Corwin there across the room, the cross of valor pinned now among his other medals. Surrounded for a time by well-wishers he clearly did not know how to receive gracefully, and was doing his level best to receive gracefully anyway, in the same dogged, unglamorous way, I imagine. That he had once climbed a stranger's roof in bad weather because it needed doing. I did not go to him immediately. I understood, without anyone telling me, that the moment belonged first to the court, and that a private word between us would mean more, not less, for waiting until the crowd around him had thinned. It was nearly an hour before I found my chance, slipping toward the edge of the hall where he had at last found a moment's breathing room near an open window. A cup of wine he did not appear to have touched held loosely in one hand. "You did well today, Your Highness," he said, before I had said anything at all. "I watched your hands. For what it's worth, from where I stood, they looked perfectly steady. They weren't, not entirely, but I think I understand now that it doesn't matter as much as I thought it would." Something warmed in his face. "That's the whole of the lesson, then. You've learned in a fortnight what took me the better part of 2 years to properly believe." "I had a good teacher," I said, "even if he didn't know he was teaching me." Corwin laughed at that, a real laugh, low and startled out of him, the first time I had ever heard the sound from him directly rather than caught second-hand through a half-open door. I suppose I did at that, though I'll admit I'd have chosen a rather less alarming way to go about it had anyone consulted me on the method. "Would you have told me, if I'd simply asked you outright, the ordinary way, instead of hiding in a corridor?" He considered this honestly. The way I had already come to understand was simply how he considered everything. "I don't know that I would have, if I'm truthful with you. Not at first, anyway. I don't imagine I'd have known how to talk to a prince the way I talked to Alaric, not without a good deal more time between us to build the trust for it. I think, in an odd way, the corridor did something an ordinary conversation might not have managed nearly as quickly. You heard me before you knew to be careful of what a prince is and isn't meant to hear from a man like me. I'm not certain I'd recommend the method to anyone else, and I hope you won't make a habit of it going forward. But I can't honestly say, looking at you now, that I wish it had never happened." "Neither can I admitted." "Good," he said. "Then we'll call the whole business settled and never speak of the corridor itself again, if it's all the same to you. I've had quite enough excitement out of one spring." I did not, as it happened, keep that promise entirely. We spoke of the corridor a handful of times more over the years that followed, though always lightly, always as a shared joke between us rather than a wound either of us still carried. But in every way that mattered, the thing between us had settled, exactly as he said, into something steadier and more honest than either of us had expected a wandering boy and a reluctant hero to build out of 2 stolen weeks of eavesdropping and 1 difficult apology in a supper courtyard. What I have not yet told you, because it did not happen all at once, in one tidy conversation the way stories are sometimes shaped to feel, is what came after, in the months and years that followed, and how the single afternoon in that corridor turned out to be only the beginning of something rather than the whole of it. My household, once the matter of the closed corridor had settled, and my mother had satisfied herself that I had learned whatever lesson wandering off unsupervised had needed to teach me, relaxed its watch on me by degrees, the way it always eventually did. And with that freedom returned, I found, to my quiet delight, that Corwin's posting rotation had shifted that summer nearer the main gate, closer to the parts of the palace I was permitted to walk freely, and that Alaric had a way of arranging, without ever quite admitting he was arranging anything, for the two of us to cross paths in ordinary, unremarkable ways. A nod exchanged during my morning walk with my tutor. A few minutes' conversation when my grandfather sent me on some small errand that happened to pass near Corwin's post, an afternoon here and there, sanctioned now, open now, no longer requiring either of us to hide anything from anyone. I learned, over those months, the things a proper friendship teaches you that a fortnight of eavesdropping never could. I learned his son's name was Wren, and that Wren had, in the year that followed his father's cross of valor, begun asking Corwin more questions about the guard than he ever had before, questions Corwin answered, he told me once, with far more patience and far more honesty than the questions of any recruit under his own command, because a son's questions about his father's work are never really about the work at all. I learned that Corwin's wife, a quiet, capable woman named Sella, whom I met properly for the first time at a small household gathering the following winter, kept the box of Wren's drawings herself now in a cedar chest at their cottage, adding to it each season, and that she had told Corwin, not long after Founder's Day, that she had never once doubted he deserved the medal, only doubted whether he would ever let himself believe it, and that watching him finally receive it had been, for her, worth every long rotation he had ever stood. I told him things, too, over that year and the years that followed, not confessions of the same weight his had been, not at first, but small honest things I had never before had anyone to say them to, the ordinary fears and doubts of a boy growing steadily more aware of the size of the life waiting for him. I told him, the autumn I turned 12, that I had overheard my tutors discussing whether I had the temperament for kingship at all, and how the words had lodged themselves in me for weeks afterward like a splinter I could not work loose. He listened to the whole of it without once telling me the tutors were wrong, which I expected, and which I think would have comforted me less than what he actually said, which was that temperament was not a fixed thing handed to a person at birth, any more than steadiness was, that he had not been born the man who stood that post outside my great-grandmother's door. He had built that man slowly, out of choices made under pressure, year after year, and that I was entirely capable of building whatever kind of king I decided, deliberately, to become, provided I was willing to keep choosing it on the difficult days as well as the easy ones. There was a particular afternoon, the spring I turned 13, that I have thought of often since, because it was the first time I understood I had actually begun to carry what he had given me rather than merely admire it from a distance. My brother Bram, 6 years old that year and prone to a wild, unmanageable terror of thunderstorms that none of us had ever quite found a way to soothe, had worked himself into a state during a particularly violent storm that shook the old windows of the nursery wing, and Malin, only 9 herself and unequal to the task despite her best efforts, had come running to find me in a genuine panic, certain nothing could be done. I found Bram curled in the corner of his room, sobbing in the particular helpless way very small children sob when fear has entirely overtaken them, and I did not, as I might once have, simply try to talk him out of the fear or promise him, uselessly, that the storm would end soon. I sat down on the floor beside him instead, close but not crowding him, the way I had once sat across from Corwin on a low stone wall, and I told him, in the plainest words I could find for a 6-year-old, that being afraid of the storm did not mean anything was wrong with him, that even grown men who had done far braver things than either of us had ever done still felt fear, and that the fear did not need to be gone before he could feel safe. It only needed somewhere to sit for a little while, right here, right next to me, until it had run its course. I do not know if it was my words exactly that settled him, or simply the fact of someone sitting quietly beside him without demanding the fear disappear on command, but he quieted by degrees, curled against my side until the worst of the storm had passed, and afterward, tucking him into bed, I understood with a small private clarity that I had just done, in miniature, in a nursery instead of a corridor, the very thing Corwin had described doing outside a dying woman's door. Given someone frightened a steady thing to lean against, without pretending the fear itself was anything other than real. I did not tell Corwin about that evening for some time, oddly enough, though I am not entirely sure why I held it back, some private instinct, I think, that certain things need to be lived a while before they are spoken of, The same instinct that had once kept his own private grief locked behind a half-open door for 20 years before he found the words to hand even a small piece of it to me. When I finally did tell him, the following autumn, walking together along the eastern wall during one of the ordinary, unremarkable visits that had by then become simply part of the shape of my life, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice with something thick in it that I had not often heard from him, "That's the whole of it, Your Highness." That's every single thing I ever tried to say to Alaric in that corridor, done exactly right, by an 11-year-old boy who happened to be listening at the wrong moment for entirely the right reasons. I don't imagine I could ask for better proof that the 2 weeks were worth whatever trouble they cost either of us. My father found me that evening, the day of the storm with Bram, sitting alone afterward in the window seat of my own room, and though I had said nothing to anyone about what had passed in the nursery, he seemed, in the particular way Rowan has always had of noticing things without making a show of noticing them, to sense that something in me had shifted that day. "Malin tells me you settled your brother during the worst of it," he said, settling himself on the wide stone sill across from me, the storm's last light still catching pale and gray through the glass. "She says you didn't try to talk him out of being frightened, just sat with him." "Someone taught me that's usually better than trying to talk the fear away," I said. "I didn't really believe it until I tried it myself." My father was quiet a moment, turning that over. "Your grandfather taught me something similar, once, though it took me a good deal longer than it's apparently taken you to actually put it to use. I was younger than you the first time I stood beside him for a public duty, barely 8, at a garden dedication that meant nothing to anyone by the following year, and I was sick with nerves the whole morning of it, certain I would embarrass him in front of half the court. He didn't tell me not to be afraid. He told me being afraid and being ready were not opposites, and that I'd have a very long life ahead of me if I spent it waiting for the fear to leave before I let myself be ready. I don't think I understood him properly, until I was a grown man with children of my own standing in front of me. Did it help at 8 years old? Not especially, if I'm honest, Rowan said, and there was a warmth in the admission that made me love him rather more than I already did. I think some lessons simply have to wait for us to be ready to hear them properly, no matter how plainly they're spoken. You seem to have found your version of it a good deal sooner than I found mine. I don't entirely know how, and I confess your mother and I have wondered more than once these past weeks what exactly changed in you this spring. But whatever it was, Torin, I am glad of it, and I don't need to know every detail of it to see the good it's done you. I did not tell him about the corridor that evening. I have never fully told him, even now, the whole of how it happened, though I suspect, given how observant my father has always been, that he has long since guessed the shape of it even without the particulars, and has simply had the grace, in the way he has always had grace with me, to let me keep that one thing as entirely my own. The lesson did not settle into me all at once, whatever the window seat conversation with my father might make it sound like. There were setbacks in the years that followed, more than I have space here to properly account for, an address before the full court at 14 that I stumbled through badly enough that I lay awake half that night convinced I had undone every scrap of progress the Founder's Day ceremony had won me. A hunting accident involving a household groom the same year that left me badly shaken and unable, for a short while afterward, to trust my own steadiness at all. But each time I found myself returning, almost by instinct now, to the same small handful of tools a guardsman had once handed a friend in an antechamber, without knowing a prince would carry them onward for the rest of his life. A fixed point for the eyes, a slower breath than felt natural. A single sentence, repeated as many times as it needed repeating, reminding whatever was afraid in me that its turn would come, but not yet, not while I was standing here. I sought Corwin out again more than once during those harder years, and he never once turned me away, though he was always careful. I understood this more fully as I grew older, never to let our friendship tip into something that looked, to anyone watching like favoritism or impropriety. He kept always a certain correct distance in public, addressed me always by my title in front of others, never once traded on the closeness between us for any advantage either of us might have taken from it. It was only in the quiet, ordinary corners of the palace, a courtyard, a stretch of wall, occasionally for old time's sake, a corner of that same forgotten east corridor, which I never again approached without his knowledge or invitation, that the other Corwin, the honest one, the one Alaric had always been trusted with, came out to meet me as well. It was in that same corridor, the autumn I turned 15, that I finally worked up the courage to ask him the question that had sat quietly beneath everything else for 4 years. "Do you ever wish I hadn't found you that first day?" I asked him. "If you could choose it back, knowing everything that came after the medal, all of it, would you rather I'd simply walked past and never known you were there?" He thought about it longer than I expected, the two of us standing where we had first stood on opposite sides of a half-open door, though the door itself had long since been fixed permanently open, a small, unspoken gesture, I had always suspected, of his own making. "No," he said finally. "I've turned that question over a fair number of times myself, if I'm honest with you, especially in the early days, when the finding of you still stung a bit more than I let on. But I've come to think a man can go his whole life keeping the true parts of himself locked up tight in rooms nobody wanders into, and call that discipline, and even be right to call it that, most of the time. And every so often, if he's fortunate, the world finds a crack in that discipline anyway, and something true gets out into the hands of exactly the person who most needed to carry it forward. I don't think I was fortunate by design, Your Highness. I think I was simply fortunate. And I've decided, these last years, that a man ought to be grateful for that kind of fortune, rather than spend his life wishing the crack had never opened. Years have passed since that spring, more of them now than I always quite believe when I stop to count. And Corwin still serves, though his own posting has settled these last seasons into training the newest recruits taken into the Guard, a role I have come to think suits him better than any other could, because there is no one in Eldermoor better equipped to teach a frightened young soldier what to do with fear than a man who spent 20 years learning it firsthand and never once pretended, to himself or to anyone else, that the lesson was finished. Wren, his son, is grown now into a young man himself, and joined the Guard's training company 2 years past, over, I am told, and I believe it, knowing the family as I do, his father's genuine and heartfelt attempt to talk him into some quieter trade first, an attempt Corwin made. He told me plainly, not because he doubted his son's courage, but because he understood, better than most fathers ever will, exactly what the uniform asks of the people who love the man wearing it, and wanted Wren to choose it with his eyes as open as his father's had never quite been at that age. Wren chose it anyway, and I am told, though I have not yet seen it myself, that he keeps a small worn drawing folded in his kit, of a guardsman standing very straight beside a house with smoke rising from its chimney, though he has never told anyone, including his father, exactly why. I still think, more often than I could easily explain to anyone who had not stood where I stood that spring, of a single sentence spoken to a friend in a forgotten corner of an old palace by a man who did not know a prince was listening. Fear isn't a thing you get rid of. It is a thing you carry alongside whatever else you're carrying, and the trick is only making sure it doesn't get to hold the reins. I have carried that sentence with me into every difficult room I have entered since, into rehearsal halls and council chambers, into the quiet hours before duties I dreaded and duties I merely doubted myself equal to, into every occasion, and there have been a great many of them in the years since, when the size of what waits for me in this family's future has threatened to feel larger than I know how to hold. It has never once made the fear disappear. I no longer expect it to. What it has done, every single time, is remind me that the fear and the duty were never actually in competition with one another. That a man, or a boy, or someday a king, can be entirely afraid and entirely steady in the very same breath, provided he has decided in advance which one gets to speak first. I think often, too, of what kind of king I hope to become, on the distant day that title finally settles onto my own shoulders rather than my father's. And I find, when I imagine it honestly, that the image which comes to me first is not a throne, or a crown, or any of the grand ceremonial trappings I have spent my whole childhood rehearsing for. It is a guardsman on a bench in a forgotten antechamber, telling a friend the truth because the truth needed somewhere honest to be told, not knowing that the truth would go on, quietly, to shape a boy who had no business overhearing it into someone slightly more equal to the weight he would one day be asked to carry. If I am fortunate enough to be even half the kind of steady, unclaiming, quietly decent man Corwin Aldridge has been in every year I have known him, a man who mends roofs he is never thanked for, who stands posts that cost him more than he will ever say aloud, who gives his fear somewhere honest to wait rather than pretending it away, I will consider whatever crown I am given, whenever it comes, very well earned indeed. That is the whole of the story, or as much of it as I have ever managed to put into words. I was 11 years old, and I hid in a corridor I had no business hiding in, and a man who did not know I was there told the truth to a friend he trusted, and it changed the entire shape of who I meant to become. I do not know that I would recommend the method to anyone. But I have never once, not in all the years since, regretted a single minute I spent standing in that shadowed archway, learning, quite by accident, the only lesson about duty that has ever actually stayed with me, that the crown, in the end, is never about the absence of fear at all. It is only and always about what a person chooses to do with it, and who they choose to be steady for while it waits its turn.